If we summarize the final cause of the Civil War, we can safely say it was the Southern states' refusal to accept as legitimate the election of the Republican Party candidate Abraham Lincoln. It was sparked by the issue of federal property seized by the South, ignited, ironically, by the side that stood on the defensive, the South. The South had no need nor plans to invade the North to achieve its objectives. It would have achieved them by just hanging on to its current position before Fort Sumter. It was the North that would have to go to war to change the current situation. But with 16 to 18,000 regular troops, mostly stationed in the frontier west, it was not in any state to do anything without first announcing its intentions by mobilizing more troops. Yet, ironically, as we saw, it was the South that had fired the first shots. Although whether it had been manipulated into doing so by Lincoln remains a question of historical debate to this day. Lincoln's Secretary of State, William Seward, after Fort Sumter, ceased his backroom maneuvering around Lincoln and now backed the president loyally, again, in response to Lincoln's forgiving nature. After the fiasco of the misguided ship Powhatan that ended up being sent to Fort Pickens instead of Fort Sumter because of Seward's intrigues against the Navy Department, Lincoln took the blame on himself, saying it was his own error, not Seward's or anyone else's fault. On the outbreak of the war, the Union strategy was sometimes contradictory, sometimes overlapping. As Lincoln in April 1861 called for the mobilization of 75,000 militia troops for 3 months, Seward and the U.S. Army Commander-in-Chief Winfield Scott agreed that the physical occupation of the South was not feasible, in fact, impossible. It was beyond the strength of the U.S. federal army. The best way to deal with the Confederacy would be by a blockade, an economic pressure which they hoped would turn the people in the South against the secession and bring them back into the Union. Scott proposed choking off all the seaports of the Confederacy by a blockade and securing, with 60,000 troops dropped off by gunboats, all the major points along the Mississippi River from the Gulf to the state of Illinois, and then to stop and wait for the Confederacy to collapse from within. It's not quite clear how, but the plan was described like the action of a boa constrictor, slowly squeezing its prey to death. This kind of slow blockade did not satisfy those who had wanted more immediate action. The focus of immediate action would have been an attack on Richmond. Richmond, of course, is just 100 miles from Washington, D.C., and many felt that a decisive attack against the capital of the Confederacy would be the way to break Confederate morale and eventually suppress the secession. Scott saw a more extensive strategy. What Scott saw was the blockading of the ports, certainly a push on Richmond, but what he predicted was a much slower process of reducing the Confederacy. The plan that Scott had was, first of all, a seizure of the Shenandoah Valley and a push towards the rivers, Mississippi, the Ohio River, the Tennessee River. Rivers, of course, are essential modes of transportation at that time. They were the superhighways, especially in the South, as they had not really developed their railway system. So rivers became highly strategic, in particular, the Mississippi River. A push down the Mississippi River was anticipated and planned for from both the north and the south. And that's precisely what will happen. The Union will drive from the north down the Mississippi towards Vicksburg, and then from the south as well through New Orleans and up this way, as you can see on your map there. Once the Mississippi in this plan is secured, then the plan called for kind of a squeezing of the Confederacy, a kind of push from all the flanks onto the Confederacy, driving them with their backs towards the Atlantic. This will be derisively referred to by the press as Scott's Great Snake, or the Anaconda Plan. And in fact, the Anaconda Plan is pretty much how we'll see that the Civil War will be fought. So there are these two views. One belief that there had to be a quick, successful battle where the South spine could be broken, and that was seen as the taking of Richmond. It was considered to be the most significant target in a kind of quick resolution. On the other hand, we had a much more realistic plan, the Anaconda Plan. Richmond, just because, as I say, of its proximity to Washington, seemed to be like this tantalizing shortcut to defeating the South, an alternative to the Anaconda Plan. Perhaps by taking Richmond, it was thought that this war can be significantly shortened, if not resolved. The belief in general was that secession was an ideology of shallow roots and capricious loyalty that could be easily overthrown. American military culture at that time tended to still be rooted in melodramatic Napoleonic terms, tinged with the rhetoric of the Minutemen of the American Revolution. In those days, armies were thrown together in a matter of days, inspired by the nobility of the cause and its leaders, and victories were won in decisive and sudden movements without much reference to the complexities of weapons, engineering, logistics, or even necessarily strategic planning. War in the pre-industrial age had been, until about a century before, a simple phenomenon. Victories determined between two lines of opposing sides, taking smoothbore musket and cannon fire from each other until one side ran out of ammunition, ran away, or was massacred where it stood. The side that remained standing was the victor. The dimension of this type of warfare was easily gauged by men of moderate intellect and education. What counted was drive and determination and a talent to lead, charisma. Training of troops was not an issue. Drill was. Troops were drilled and conditioned to stand in lines and take fire without running away, at least in theory. Beyond that, little else was required of a soldier in that epoch. This Minuteman quick resolution of the war, the call for one decisive battle became a roar of voices when the Confederacy had moved its capital to Richmond, Virginia. As I say, just 100 miles south of Washington, D.C. Politicians, the public, and the press now urged one quick, decisive assault on the capital. On to Richmond became a slogan that was difficult to ignore by those counseling a more thorough but slower defeat of the Confederates. Of course, the call on to Richmond or forward to Richmond would become a recipe for disaster and waste of time, lives, and material. Both of these notions, a slow economic blockade of the South, or the breaking of its will by a single decisive battle, did not imply any major changes to race relations in the South as a result of a Northern victory. In 1861, that was not even on the agenda. It was not about the abolition of slavery at the onset of the war, but about dragging the South back into the Union. The South, on its part, of course, had no need to invade the North, but political pressure was felt to ensure the South's security and to affirm its independence. And the presence of Union troops at Fort Sumter and at Fort Pickens was an irritant to Southern pride, but not really a threat to its independence as long as the status quo remained. But for Southern mentality, an irritant to pride was a big deal. There was a kind of racial mentality that the South imposed not only on its slaves, but on Northerners themselves. Northerners were perceived as a race enfeebled by industrial life. They sat indoors in offices, traveled by carriage and comfortable train, and lived in cities, as opposed to Southerners who ruled on horseback over plantations and carried rifles to hunt and protect themselves. Southerners saw Northerners to be passionate only about making money, while Southern gentlemen were passionate about honor and dueled for it. Northerners sued in court. Southerners believed that they were a unique military culture and pointed out that Winfield Scott and George Washington were Southerners. It was no coincidence that Kentucky-born Jefferson Davis, the Confederate president, was a former U.S. Secretary of War under President Franklin Pierce. The problem was that many in the North believed in this Southern view themselves. They, too, were concerned that industrialism had made them weak and fat and slow, and that Southern forces were intrinsically more military and ferocious than they were. Many Northern leaders, particularly McClellan, the best example, deeply feared engaging Southerners in combat. The belief in the viability of a short and quick war, however, in the North was reinforced by the North's self-awareness of its industrial capacity and population strength. Again, in 1860, the population of the United States was 31.5 million. The Confederate States would take away only 8.7 million, of which nearly a third, 3.9 million, were slaves, and as slaves were not allowed to serve in the Confederate Army. The border states, Maryland, Kentucky, Delaware, and Washington, D.C., represented a population of 3.5 million. As long as the Union could hang on to the border states along with its western states, it had a population of 22.7 million versus 8.7 million of the Confederate States. So it would have a numeric superiority of 4-1. The North theoretically could raise 4 million troops to every 1 million of the South's. And even with Virginia and Tennessee, the most industrialized of the Confederate States, it still had only 1/9 of the North's industrial capacity. In the 1860s, Massachusetts and Pennsylvania each produced on their own goods that were twice the value of the South's entire production. In 1860, the United States in the North produced 97% of all firearms, 94% of all cloth, 93% of all pig iron, and 90% of footwear. So in terms of the South certainly as an agrarian state could produce enough food to sustain itself. It lacked a means of distributing it. Again, as you can see from this map of 31,000 miles of track, only 9,000 miles was located in the 11 Confederate states. And so their distribution system, their logistical system was significantly underpowered compared to the industrial North. In general, the United States had tended to expand westwards, and railways in the North were built first to connect northern ports on the Atlantic, New York and Boston, with northern cities on the interior, like Buffalo, Philadelphia, and Pittsburgh, on an east-west axis. And after that, more distant western cities, Chicago, Detroit, Columbus, Cincinnati. The North was in a much better position in distributing the products of its industrial might and moving its troops around. Lincoln responded quickly to the war crisis, calling on April 15th for states to raise 75,000 militiamen for 3 months' service. This precipitated the secession of several states who were unwilling to fight against their southern neighbors. April 19th, Lincoln proclaimed a blockade of southern ports and proceeded to attempt to choke the secessionists off by economic means. Lincoln very quickly realized that this was not going to be a 3-month war. And now he issued a second call for troops for 3 years' service. 43,000 responded to this call, and more. By July 1st, some 300,000 men had been mobilized on a variety of enlistments state by state, ranging from 3 months to 3 years. Lincoln rushed ahead without waiting for Congress to approve the measures, getting approval retroactively. Support for Lincoln in these initial moments of crises was bipartisan, very much like the kind of support Bush had in the wake of 9/11. Where both the Democratic and a Republican side backed his desires, essentially, in view of the crisis that the United States was facing after the attacks on the World Trade Center. In the South, Jefferson Davis had been empowered to raise troops directly without having to go through the states. By August 1861, he raised 200,000 volunteers. To overcome the internal blockade, Davis sent agents to Britain, which was very sympathetic to the South, or perhaps just hostile to the North. There, the Confederates purchased some 800,000 British Enfield rifles, the equivalent British-made rifle to the American Springfield rifle. And this purchase of 800,000 British rifles was just the start of a clandestine supply route from the factories and warehouses of Britain toward the Confederacy. In the last lecture, I took you through the opening battles of the Civil War, the West Virginia Mountain Campaign. These were essentially minor skirmishes. Although they were of enormous political significance, they will appear to be, as I say, minor skirmishes compared to what's coming. There were other aspects of modernity that is going to creep into the Civil War, making it what has been described as the first total war of the industrialized world. The media and public opinion would have tremendous impact on the conduct of the war, especially so in a relatively democratic society with a constitutional electoral process. The telegraph introduced in the mid-1840s allowed for news to be transmitted at a speed comparable today when you come to the question of newsprint. A story that occurs on, say, a Thursday night can be effectively reported in the newspapers by Friday morning. Telegraphic distribution of news stories, steam-driven press essentially distributed newsprint at the same speed that it is distributed today, perhaps even quicker than today, as newsprint has become kind of decrepit and no longer a major source of news. So certainly when it had been the only source of news in the kind of pre-electronic radio television days, newsprint was a very robust system of informing the people on the progress of the war and the directions that the conduct of the war is taking. And of course, that has all sorts of political repercussions. Lincoln would have to constantly deal with criticism in the newspapers, the kind of criticism that certainly leaders in the past, say a Napoleon, did not have to contend with in kind of dictatorial societies. But Lincoln, we'll see, will be constantly under pressure by U.S. newsprint media. Cartoons will often ridicule him, will often bitterly compare him to, the devil. He's often portrayed, as you can see in this illustration, with horns coming out of his hair. He's portrayed as communing with the devil, and so in a system where the leader is facing then an election every 4 years, this has a significant impact on how the war will be conducted. On to Richmond, public pressure, particularly pushed by Horace Greeley's New York Daily Tribune, becomes so great that Lincoln's cabinet on June 29th orders General Irvin P. McDowell to organize all the troops that have gathered in Washington and take them across the Potomac River into Virginia and capture Richmond, in the assumption that a bold, dramatic victory of that kind would not only calm the political criticism at home, but would precipitate a collapse of the Confederacy. McDowell was one of what some refer to as political generals, kind of like McClellan. These were men who had arrived in their high position by virtue of political connections rather than their experience or distinguished record in combat. In fact, although McDowell was a graduate in the class of 1838 at West Point and was a general's aide in the Mexican-American War and was a conscientious and earnest officer, he had never held a wartime command himself or led troops in battle. And yet, because of McDowell's connections to Ohio's Salmon P. Chase, exactly like McClellan, McDowell was put in charge of the Army of the Potomac and its mission to capture Richmond. The pressure on Lincoln in particular was the 75,000 troops he had called out on a 3-month enlistment. As the summer now, as the United States now entered into the summer period, that 3-month enlistment was about to run out. And so Lincoln now pressured McDowell to act and take out Richmond. McDowell himself argued against it, feeling that his troops were not sufficiently trained and organized for this kind of major battle. Yet he had no choice. Lincoln personally ordered McDowell to move forward. And so the first step to march on Richmond would be obviously, firstly, crossing the Potomac. The Union took the city of Alexandria, and then they would need to secure a junction at Manassas, Virginia, right there. And this is kind of indicative of how wars would be now fought in the industrial age. Railroads often will guide the kind of strategy that is going to be adopted in this new emerging age of industrial warfare. So at the end of June, troops begin to march towards Manassas in an attempt to secure, as I say, that railway junction that you can see at Manassas, and then wheel southward towards Richmond. That at least is the plan. At Manassas, General Beauregard, the same general who had first fired against Fort Sumter, he stood at that railway juncture with about 22,000 Confederate troops. Another 11,000 Confederate troops under General Joseph Johnson were positioned up in the Shenandoah Valley, just outside of Harper's Ferry. McDowell assigned Major General Robert Patterson to take 18,000 Union troops up to the Shenandoah Valley and pin down Johnson's forces at that position. McDowell would then attack with about 35,000 troops, counting on Patterson to prevent Beauregard's 22,000 troops from being reinforced by Johnson's troops from the north. What went wrong? Because certainly we're going to see that Manassas is a disaster for the Union. Well, three things that we take for granted in warfare today made themselves resoundingly felt at the Battle of Manassas. Um, one, espionage. Two, telegraphic communications. And third, steam-driven mobility, the railway. No sooner had McDowell started out from Alexandria towards Manassas when Confederate spy Rose O'Neal Greenhow, the Irish Rose, couriered and telegraphed in code the information to Beauregard that the Union Army was on the march and passing through Alexandria on the way south to Manassas. And espionage, of course, conducted by females is not necessarily new, but certainly in the kind of Victorian conservative society that the United States was, it was a new role for women that we're going to see is quite robust in the Civil War, female spies. And so very quickly, Rose Greenhow manages to get the information from Alexandria to Beauregard in Manassas. Beauregard can, within seconds, telegraph it to Richmond, and Richmond at that point, again, within seconds, could telegraph that intelligence information and orders as well to Johnson's army in the Shenandoah Valley. Beauregard made no attempt to slow McDowell's approach. Instead, he just dug in, waiting. In the meantime, Johnson secretly, without Patterson realizing it, broke away from the Union troops and loaded up on the railway to make their way south to Manassas. And they're going to arrive there in the afternoon of the second day of the battle at Manassas. In fact, they'll be there within 25 hours, which is again a remarkable aspect of how war is now fought at a much quicker rate than in the past. The plan that McDowell had was what we'll see a typical oblique angle attack. This called for a frontal diversionary assault on Confederate lines with the major bulk of the forces outflanking the Confederates, as you can see again illustrated on this map. The attack began on the 21st of July. Everybody assumed that this would be an easy victory over the Confederate troops. People arrived from Washington, politicians, the public. They set up blankets with picnic baskets and champagne to watch below them this battle, which they planned on watching like a spectator sport. As everyone was commenting how they're just going to beat the Confederate rabble, by the end of the day and rush on down to Richmond and suppress the uh, essentially the secession. And at first, it seemed as if this was occurring. By noon, McDowell had indeed began to drive the Confederates back, driving them off the battlefields at Manassas. And so as the diversionary troops pinned down the Confederate lines, McDowell's troops outflanked them and began driving around behind the Confederate lines, threatening essentially to now surround Beauregard. By the end of the day, the battle had gone so well that people were already overrunning the battlefield with collecting souvenirs, spent cartridges, bits of uniform, whatever they could collect. What goes wrong, of course, is all these troops now arrive from Shenandoah Valley the next morning. And in particular, among them is this one brigade of Virginians under General Thomas Jackson, the same Jackson that I had described to you at West Point, the same Jackson who had seized the trains at Harper's Ferry. And Jackson, as McDowell is driving forward on the second day, on the morning of 21st of July, to finish off the Confederates, Jackson now begins to block McDowell's approach by himself, right there at the Henry Hill house. And McDowell just can't get Thomas Jackson's brigade dug out of that position. And here, of course, you have this famous story. One of the Confederate officers is supposed to have shouted to his men, look, boys, look at Jackson's brigade. It stands like a stone wall. Rally behind the Virginians. End of quote. And that's how Jackson earns his nickname, Stonewall Jackson. But, typical of history, there is a backstory, in fact, how Stonewall Jackson gets that nickname. The story of Thomas Jackson's resistance at the Henry House, or the Henry House Hill, doesn't appear until 4 days after the battle. And it's first reported in a Charleston, South Carolina newspaper, in an article not about Thomas Jackson, but about the officer who made that remark, a South Carolina General, Bernard E. B. Jackson himself, as a Virginian, is unknown in South Carolina. What apparently happened was B's unit had been decimated in the hours before Jackson had arrived. And when Jackson got to the battlefield, B, upon reporting to him of his losses, was told by Jackson not to worry. Quote, "Sir, we will give them the bayonet." According to the newspaper report, B then turned to the remainder of his brigade and said, quote, "There is Jackson standing like a stone wall. Let us determine to die here, and we will conquer." End of quote. The question is, and it's one that's still unresolved, is whether B was actually complimenting Jackson or complaining that Jackson was holding back and not coming to his own aid. One witness to the conversation between General B and Jackson, Asher Hamilton, a captain in Jackson's brigade, recalls that B had asked Jackson to advance in support of his badly embattled position, and Jackson refused, citing orders to hold his own position at any cost. Later, this officer, Asher Hamilton, would comment, quote, "I'm not the least sure that General B's remark, 'There stands Jackson and his men like a stone wall,' was meant as a compliment." It was Virginia newspapers that began to reprint this story and gradually began to move Jackson into prominence. Jackson, of course, was the highest ranking Virginian on the field at the Battle of Manassas, and Virginia's state pride drove its press to highlight this story, which began to appear in Richmond newspapers a whole week after the battle. The only person who could really have explained what he meant by his comment was, of course, the man who made it, General Bernard B. But within minutes of making that comment and returning to battle, B was shot and died the next day. And so that is the canonical story as it's told, and it's typical of examples of the pitfalls of press reports as sources of history in general. Typical of history, as Oscar Wilde says, history is what everybody thinks should have happened. In the end, I guess it doesn't matter whether the comment was complimentary or not. Stonewall Jackson became a nickname that Jackson and his soldiers were proud of. And that's the way that history reports it. Jackson becomes Stonewall Jackson. And of course, Stonewall Jackson to this day is probably one of, after Robert E. Lee, the most recognized and lionized of Confederate generals. This is the plaque from Battle of Manassas Battlefield Park. And there again, it kind of repeats that story about B shouting out, "There stands Jackson like a stone wall," rally behind the Virginians. It was probably B said that in anger and in frustration rather than in a complimentary way that it become. But Stonewall, the South's terrible swift sword, will now become this legendary figure in both the Confederacy and to this day in a kind of neo-Confederate culture. Other things happen at Manassas that gradually shift the battle from Union advantage on the first day to Confederate victory on the second day. One of the things was the destruction of Union artillery. By mid-afternoon of the first day, the dust had blended into sweaty uniforms into a kind of common hue. There was difficulty distinguishing between the predominantly, although not entirely, gray uniforms of the Confederacy and the blue of the Union. And this would be fatal to McDowell's artillery, which is inflicting significant damage on Confederate troops. Suddenly, on the right front of the Union artillery, the artillery batteries see a line of advancing blue-clad infantry. They appear through the smoke. This is the 33rd Regiment of Virginia Volunteers. At this early stage in the war, the colors of the uniforms had not been completely standardized, and so some Confederates are wearing blue uniforms as they had in the past. The Union artillery commander orders canister shot to be loaded. This is instead of kind of explosive cannonballs, canister shot is just almost like shotgun shot, except much heavier and larger. Grape shot, sometimes you hear the term, that is intended to be fired point blank into advancing infantry. But the chief artillery officer on McDowell's staff overruled the order, claiming that the oncoming blue uniforms belonged to friendly infantry arriving in support of the North. And so with kind of great trepidation, the Union artillery watches these blue-clad Virginians advance within 70 yards of the Union guns. And then they just level their rifles at the artillerymen and open fire. And essentially the infantry now kills most of the gunners before they realize that indeed they're facing Confederates who are still wearing old style blue uniforms, and it essentially takes out the Federal guns. For the rest of the battle day, the Federal artillery now, the Union artillery, is just stands silent, unserved, and helpless, trapped between the two armies. It also demonstrates the power of the new rifles that were being introduced into this war. It's going to be significantly different from the war that Americans were most experienced in, the Mexican-American War that they had fought approximately 20 years earlier, with a whole different type of infantry weapon. And so that too contributes to this disaster. And so as the next day in the afternoon, Beauregard, with two additional fresh brigades that had arrived from the Shenandoah Valley, now launches a counterattack on the Union Army and begins to drive the Union back. And by 6:30 p.m., the Union now is in total panic. It's not just that they're falling back, but now it's a complete, total rout. All the picnickers as well now suddenly realize that they're in danger, and there's only a single bridge out of that particular corner of the battlefield, and so everybody escaping, running, frightened Union troops, the picnickers, the senators, the public that had come, all jam onto this bridge trying to get the hell out of there. And on top of that, it begins to rain, and the Union Army is completely broken and disorganized at Manassas, and they basically march through the night, through the rain, into Washington, where, much to the shock of Washingtonians, the defeated, wet, wounded, demoralized Union troops, many of them separated from their units. It's just the mob that begins to enter early in the morning into Washington, D.C., and people begin to realize that there's a disaster. And in fact, had this been part of Confederate strategy, they could have theoretically marched into Washington that day, and they would not have been stopped. They could have walked all the way up to the White House and set it on fire. The only problem, of course, is it wasn't part of the Confederate strategy. The Confederates had hoped at best to hold off the Union at Manassas, but they were not at all prepared for the victory that Manassas would become. And so 21st of July, 1861, in the first major engagement of the war, known as in the South as the Battle of Manassas, in the North as the Battle of Bull Run. In fact, it's known as the Battle of Manassas I or Battle of Bull Run I, because there will be a second battle the next year, and it will end badly for the Union again as well. But this is the first battle, and it's a disaster. Of McDowell's 35,000 men, only 18,000 actually crossed Bull Run. And casualties among these, including the missing, numbered at 2,700. Beauregard, with 32,000 men, ordered 18,000 into action, about one-on-one, compared to McDowell's 18,000 across Bull Run. And he lost 1,982 troops. And of course, this loss in battle in one day was equivalent to the entire American losses in the Mexican-American War. This too comes as a great shock to both sides, both the Confederacy and the Union. So both sides essentially showed ineptitude. The South, although victorious, never pursued the retreating Union forces, nor did they move towards Washington, which had been entirely unprepared for a defense. It was, for Washingtonians, for the Union, it was inconceivable that this rabble would have defeated their well-trained army that was approaching Manassas. So in one sense, it's a lost opportunity, but it does break the Union attack into central Virginia, and it does break the Union's first attempt to capture Richmond. And Richmond, in the end, even though it's 100 miles away from Washington, won't be captured until three and a half years later, when the war is coming to an end. This Southern victory at Manassas had both immediate and long-range effects on the efforts of both the northern and southern sides. It compels, first of all, northern leaders to face up to the nature and scope of the struggle. And they now begin the task of putting the Union on full war footing. They realize this isn't going to be a quick march on Richmond ending to the war, that very likely this is going to be, just as General Scott had anticipated, a long, drawn-out strategic industrial war requiring logistics and massive movements across the American continent. It's going to take several years, exactly as Scott is anticipating. Secondly, it makes the politicians in Washington more willing, particularly Lincoln, to heed the advice of professional soldiers directing military operations across a vast continental landscape, from Point Lookout in Maryland to, Fort Craig in central New Mexico. This is a huge war of, again, Napoleonic scale, maybe even a First World War scale. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, the American Civil War, just geographically, territorially, is fought over a greater kind of square mileage than the First World War had been fought, where, most of the First World War had been rooted in Belgium and France. The Civil War, the American Civil War, is going to have a much more extensive scope of battle. Third, it's often said that what happens in the first battle of the war often sets the tone for the rest of the war. Well, losing the first major battle can be demoralizing, and it will certainly set a low tone for the Union, in many ways confirming their worst fears that Confederates have fight in their blood, essentially, and that the Union men from the softer industrial North are not up to the fight. And for the Union, the Civil War would now become an uphill battle, and every subsequent defeat or lack of victory, and there will be many now facing the Union, brutally hammers on the morale of the Union and on the political stability of Lincoln's administration. And in the opposite way, it confirmed for the Confederates what they had been thinking for themselves, and gives them this kind of giddy sense of invincibility in the early months of the war. Fourth, Confederate leaders, while there is this sense of invincibility, were more sober about it. They realize that sense of invincibility or not, this is going to be a long, drawn-out war for the Confederacy as well. And now Confederates call for 400,000 volunteers and begin seeking critical military supplies in Europe. And turn to planning operations that might swing remaining slave-holding states and territories into the Confederacy. And you saw how that had occurred in previous lectures. Finally, the most potent, immediate influence of Bull Run was upon European powers, which had eyed the Confederacy as a territory with much potential for political intervention and as a source of revenue. And so, unless the U.S. Navy could make it unprofitable for private merchant ships to deliver arms to southern ports and depart with agricultural goods, in particularly valuable cotton, speculative capital would now flow from Europe increasingly into the contraband trade with the Confederacy. And so, at considerable expense and haste to make the blockade effective, the Navy, the U.S. Navy, by the end of the year had assembled 200 ships of every description, armed them in best as they could, and placed them on station. And with new congressional acts passed regarding piracy, revenue, confiscation, and enforcement in hand, commanders of this fleet now intercepted more and more the blockade runners steaming out of places like Nassau, Bermuda, and Havana on their three-day run to Wilmington, North Carolina, or Charleston, South Carolina, or Savannah, Jordan, attempting to evade the blockade. And so even in 2 round trips as a blockade runner, even if they lost their cargo on the 3rd voyage, this trade still produced a considerable profit to the owners of these private piratical vessels that were smuggling goods in and out of the Confederacy. And it wouldn't be until 1861 when this kind of profit became more difficult, because the U.S. Navy by then had introduced all these new fast ships, specially fitted for blockade duty in service. U.S. Navy, beginning in August of 1861, landed more and more Army Expeditionary Forces and gradually gained footholds in the vicinity of Mobile, Savannah, Charleston, Wilmington. By the end of the war, joint Navy-Army expeditions would convert the sea blockade into a military ground occupation and would seal off all major ports in the South. Even more important were the river fleets of the U.S. Navy on the Ohio, Missouri, and Mississippi rivers. These fleets, operating closely with local Army commanders, also provided essential elements in the evolving Union strategy of squeezing the Confederacy along the natural invasion routes of the rivers and valleys. Day after the battle, on July 22nd, 1861, Lincoln called for a 500,000-man force of 3-year volunteers, and during the rest of July, quickly disbanded the 90-day militia. The more experienced men now entered the newly authorized volunteer force. Meanwhile, the volunteer quota and the increase of regulars mobilized after Sumter had so far progressed that camps and garrisons established at strategic points along the 1,950-mile boundary with the border states and territories were just bustling with activity. As July ended, Congress authorized the volunteers to serve for the duration of the war and began to perfect their regimental organizations. So, in effect, the Lincoln administration was now building a major federal army, as opposed to the one based on kind of joint state militia federal control and support. State governors were given a quota according to the state's population, and they now began raising 1,000-man volunteer regiments. They bought locally whatever the units needed, shipped them to federal training centers, and then presented all the bills to the U.S. government. And accordingly, Congress floated a national loan of $250 million. In other words, the United States Army was organized and recruited state by state governors, by state administrations, filling a quota, and then were kind of shipped and delivered already with supplies to the federal government, which would then deploy them into battle. As these forces are being transformed into this new form, after the Battle of Manassas, both sides suspend any kind of major military operations for the time being. In the meantime, McDowell, of course, is relieved of his command in the wake of this failure, and Lincoln begins to now search out for a replacement for McDowell. And of course, the person that has become the most prominent officer in the Union Army at this moment, following his three splendid victories in West Virginia, is none other than George McClellan. And so McClellan now becomes the commander of the Army of the Potomac. He is given the same orders that McDowell had: take Richmond. And McClellan will now proceed to do what he did at Rich Mountain. He will sit and do nothing for the next 7 months, despite constant urging from President Lincoln to attack Richmond. And not only that, McClellan, within a short period of time, despite his reluctance to attack at Richmond, will also be appointed as the U.S. Army General-in-Chief as Winfield Scott retires. And so the land war essentially now grinds to a halt between July of 1861 and March of 1862. Although I should say the land war in the Eastern Theater grinds to a halt. In the West, we'll see that the land war will proceed in a different way under the command of an unknown general, Ulysses S. Grant. I'm going to give you a summary of the chronology of the Civil War up to the major turning point in the war, the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863. Most of the war, if you look at a map of the United States, is going to be fought in this area here. And there will be essentially two theaters of war, as they're referred to. One in the east, where the Army of the Potomac is going to dominate, and then one in the west. So I'll give you a kind of, as they say, chronology of the major battles between 1861 and 1863. So as you're doing your textbook reading, you at least kind of have a sense of how these battles unfolded, where, and their significance. And I'm talking about major battles because there are, over 1,000 battles, but there are these turning point major battles that kind of are like milestones in this war. So on the Eastern Theater here, we can see where Washington and Richmond are, and Fredericksburg is the halfway point between Washington and Richmond, and so it also is going to be critical as this breaking point through which the Union has to get through before they can get to Richmond. And so the first battle, Manassas won, or Bull Run won, July 21st, 1861, and it's a victory for the Confederacy, as I had described to you in the previous lecture. Once this battle is over, McClellan is appointed and given the order to finish the job. But he finished the job take out Richmond. And he begins hesitating very much the way he did at Rich Mountain. The first thing McClellan does is he exaggerates the number of forces that the Confederates have deployed in his way. And every time Lincoln sends him more troops at his request, McClellan then raises his estimates of the Confederates he must face. He is just training his army, and McClellan certainly is a brilliant administrator, and he does certainly discipline the army and drill it into shape, but he is hesitant and afraid to deploy the army. At one point, Lincoln comes down to meet McClellan and try to, force him into action. McClellan continually hesitates and refuses. At one point, McClellan suggests to Lincoln that if he wants to lead the army, why doesn't he just take over and lead the army himself? At a later point, Lincoln finally just is fed up and explicitly orders McClellan to move forward, and instead McClellan gets sick and takes to his bed, and so it takes quite a while before McClellan finally comes up with his plan of how he intends to take out Richmond. And McClellan's plan is once again based on what the United States military is learning from the Mexican War, maritime deployments. He's going to sail his army out around to Fort Monroe, south of Richmond, and then intends to march across the Yorktown Peninsula up, the James Peninsula, I guess, or along the James River towards Richmond. That's the plan. And Lincoln approves the plan, just anything to get McClellan going. But from July of 1861 until March of 1862, McClellan has been essentially stalling on doing anything. And so in the East, there are no major battles, although there are certainly skirmishes and minor battles. There are no major battles, as McClellan is just hesitating until he launches his peninsular campaign in March. And in March, McClellan, as I say, lands at Fort Monroe and begins to slowly move up this peninsula here. And McClellan actually outnumbers the Confederates something like 10-1. And yet he again begins to exaggerate the number of Confederates that he's facing. And the Confederates actually become aware that McClellan is very timid and afraid, and they use all sorts of tactics to confuse him. For example, they march Confederate forces in a circle so that McClellan's spies count the number of men marching by and get the wrong count. Confederates as well paint logs a black color to make it look like there's masses of artillery. And so McClellan, between March and July, very slowly is moving up that peninsula, digging in every time he makes a move. And in fact, McClellan is nicknamed the Virginia Creeper. The Virginia Creeper is a very slow-growing vine. And so McClellan, as you can see from this map, towards May, near the end of May, beginning of June, he actually gets in within the hearing range of church bells from Richmond. And he still does not push forward. And we'll see that the Peninsular Campaign is going to be a failure. In July of 1862, McClellan will be attacked by Stonewall Jackson in the peninsula, and in July of 1862, he'll turn around and go back to Washington. A complete failure of the Peninsular Campaign, again, to take out Richmond. And it's the last concerted effort before the end of the war to take out Richmond. And it, as I say, will be a failure. General Ulysses S. Grant, in the meantime, is in the West. And unlike McClellan, who has been just sitting out the winter in Washington on the Potomac training his army, General Grant is leading his Western Army along the Mississippi and Tennessee rivers in an attempt to close that ring that the Anaconda plan calls for. And so Grant's first victory is going to be at Fort Henry, on kind of near the Ohio River and Cumberland rivers and Tennessee River. So Fort Henry, February 6th of 1862. This is along the Tennessee-Kentucky border. He successfully takes Fort Henry, February 6, 1862. That's one of the first major victories for the Union. And then several days later, he'll take Fort Donelson, also key on the river system, on the Cumberland River. He'll then drive south, again along the Tennessee River, where at Pittsburgh Landing, the Union and Confederate armies will clash in the next major battle of the war, Shiloh, April 6th to April 7th, 1862. Nominally, Shiloh is a victory for the Union, but it's a very costly victory. And in fact, Grant will be fired after Shiloh, although Lincoln will ensure that he'll be reinstated several weeks after Shiloh. But essentially, Grant, for having sustained such heavy casualties at Shiloh, will be accused of being drunk on the eve of the battle and incompetent and so forth. But as I say, Lincoln will intervene and reestablish him. So Shiloh, April 6th, 7th on the Tennessee River, victory for the Union. Very important, the taking of Island Number 10 on the northern end of the Mississippi River. This begins the Union push down the Mississippi River. This is, again, April 7th, the same day of Shiloh. And as the Union is moving down the Mississippi, they take Memphis, June 6th, 1862. New Orleans is taken April 28th, 1862, and the Union Army will now be driving up the Mississippi River, down the Mississippi River, in an attempt to essentially, as I say, close this ring that the Anaconda plan calls for. After Shiloh, the Union Army will veer eastward and head towards Chattanooga, with the intention of eventually taking Atlanta. And that will take approximately 2 years before they actually get to Atlanta. Because once they fight their way through Chattanooga here in kind of this mountainous region, the war will become bogged down for the Union in that region. In this chronology as well, Stonewall Jackson will clean out the Union from its positions inside at the Shenandoah Valley. This is where, for example, Harper's Ferry constantly keeps changing hands. I think it changed hands some 14 times between Confederates and Unions throughout the war. And so Jackson, first of all, forces the Union out of the Shenandoah Valley, which you remember was the first territory that, according to the Anaconda plan, should have been occupied and was, but Jackson, as I said, drives the Union out of the Shenandoah Valley and then attacks McClellan in the peninsula. And that will be April to July of 1862 that Stonewall Jackson is driving at McClellan in the peninsula. And here you can see you get the kind of 7-day battles. This is 7 battles in 7 days, like Mechanicsville, Gainesville, Malvern Hill, 7-day battles in June, July are, as I say, 7 battles. Some are victories for the Union, some are victories for the Confederates, some are ties, but the consequence of all these battles eventually is that the Confederates gain momentum in the peninsula and now force McClellan to turn around and go back to Washington. So it's a complete failure. And at this point, Robert E. Lee orders for the first time a counterattack. The intention of Robert E. Lee now is to bypass Washington and try to cut off Washington by striking into Baltimore. And so in August of 62, for the first time, the Confederates now go on the offensive and they drive through essentially Virginia, clearing out the Union from Virginia, forcing them back into Washington. They cross into Maryland. And as I say, the intention is to cut off Baltimore, and you can see kind of the significance again in terms of railroad strategy, the position of Baltimore, and it's here that you get the Battle of Antietam. I should go back for a second and mention that the Battle of Shiloh, one of the significance of the Battle of Shiloh was that there were 13,000 Union casualties. That compare that to 2,800 at Bull Run the previous year. So now suddenly the casualties have risen over the 10,000 mark for the first time. In the Battle of Antietam, or again, it's known in the South as Sharpsburg, there will be a total of 23,000 casualties in a single day. This is the highest single day casualty rate in the history, in the military history of the United States. I think the U.S. Marines suffered 23,000 casualties fighting at Iwo Jima in a period of 6 weeks. Here you have 23,000 killed in a single day. It's really a draw, essentially, between the Confederates and the Union at Antietam, although the Confederates, I guess technically maybe it's a loss for the Confederates as the Confederates are driven out of Antietam, and Robert E. Lee's launch into the North is essentially now stopped. But it's not a clear victory for the Union because they failed to destroy Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. And Robert E. Lee successfully manages to get out of Antietam with most of his army intact. The Union will now try to drive at Richmond again. Fredericksburg, right there, will become the main focus of coming battles in the winter of 62-63. Fredericksburg, the Union will attempt to dislodge the Confederates at Fredericksburg, December 11th, 15th, 1862. It's a disaster for the Union. They're just massacred at Marie's Heights in Fredericksburg. The Union will again attempt to drive through Fredericksburg at Chancellorsville, which is very close to Fredericksburg. They'll try to get around Fredericksburg by going through Chancellorsville. April 3rd to May 6th, 1863. That too is a defeat for the Union, a massive disaster. In the meantime, Ulysses S. Grant has been driving up and down the Mississippi River until he finally manages to position the Union troops almost in a closed circle around the Confederacy here. The only place that's holding out is Vicksburg. Vicksburg becomes the key to the Mississippi. If Vicksburg can be taken, if the siege of Vicksburg can succeed in reducing Vicksburg, then the Anaconda plan would essentially, the first phase of it, the encirclement of the Confederacy, would be complete. So Vicksburg unfolds between June and July of 1863. It's this desperate battle, as I say, led by Ulysses S. Grant. And it's because of what's happening at Vicksburg that Robert E. Lee will attempt to take the pressure off Vicksburg by launching another attempted attack, not only at the city of Baltimore now, but he hopes to push all the way out to Philadelphia. That's his plan. And that, of course, will bring us the Battle of Gettysburg in July of 1863. It will be kind of a twin battles being resolved, the siege at Vicksburg and the Battle of Gettysburg, which is July 1st to July 3rd of 1863. And Gettysburg is the largest battle fought in the Western Hemisphere, several 100,000 men clashing in Gettysburg, and it's the turning point of the war, although it won't appear to be. It's kind of with hindsight that we see Gettysburg as the turning point, but certainly it's the biggest battle of the American Civil War, and it's the Stalingrad, essentially, of the war. It's the beginning of the end for the Confederacy. Once they cannot take the momentum at Gettysburg, and the Confederate attack through Gettysburg fails, it is essentially the beginning of the end for the Confederacy. That essentially gives you a quick chronology of just the battlefield history in terms of strategic battles that occur between 1861 and 1863.